get the show on the road, Libby.
I agree, yes. So thank you very much, Marleen and Rebecca. So hello, everyone. My name is Libby Cardell, and I'm the acting head of the School of Allied Health Sciences here at Griffith University, as well as a huge supporter of all things speech pathology, being a speech pathologist myself. So welcome to our Griffith seminar series. I think this is number 13, and wow, what numbers, just amazing. I'd like to start off though with acknowledgement of the country. It is my firm belief that we all have a role in creating workplaces, schools and communities that value, support and uphold the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet here today and learn. And I pay my respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, traditions, the culture and the hopes, and very importantly for us as speech language pathologists, the languages of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our country. So what an event today. It's all about reading success in the primary years. And this is just so important. As Marleen, my wonderful colleague, would know, one of my favourite Nelson Mandela quotes is, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." So if we can start right in the early years with establishing really fantastic literacy, the rewards for individuals and for society will absolutely be vast. So yeah, what a great topic. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Marleen from Speech Pathology at Griffith University, one of my esteemed, wonderful, fabulous colleagues, and also Dr Rebecca Armstrong, whom I know from speech pathology at the University of Queensland as well, also a bit of a superstar. Both Marleen and Rebecca have lots of clinical experience working with children, and they're both absolutely passionate about language, about literacy and special needs and communication. I mean, their research just, overarches so many areas, in autism, Down syndrome, developmental language disorders as well. And many of you would know, or perhaps were, sparked by their recent book. They are co-authors of a recent book called Reading Success in the Primary Years, in collaboration with Georgina Barton. What a success that's been too, just showing that real appetite for this area, because there's been over 40,000 downloads of this amazing book about evidence-based practice and a multi-dimensional approach. So really, you're so lucky to have these two ladies here to talk to you today. So it's wonderful to have you and to welcome you, Marleen and Rebecca. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Libby, for those very kind words, and thank you everyone for attending. So maybe on an afternoon like this, not sure where you're, watching from, but it's pretty shocking weather out here. So maybe it is nice sometimes to view things in the comfort of your own workplace or home. So let's get started. Or not. All right. So a quick overview. We've done our introduction and we'll do the quick poll in a minute. We're going to talk, of course, about the importance of reading success and the aims of our project. Really looking at some of the theoretical underpinnings, but then explain to you what our 5-step assessment to intervention approach was all about and what we found. We've got a couple of case studies and then, of course, our summary and conclusions. We hope that you will stay until the end, and then we will absolutely leave about 20 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We're going to try and multitask here. So who are you? We've just got a very brief, quick poll with just 2 simple questions, just because we're interested to find out who's actually here this afternoon, and it might help us pitch our talk a little bit. We've got 65% of people responding. Perfect. All right, so what we can see, do you want to just make it bigger for us? No, just make it bigger, I think, so we can see it. Yeah. All right. So we've got 60% speech pathologists. We've got about 40% teachers or school staff. There are some other allied health professionals. Sorry, we didn't ask you exactly who you were. We have some parents here and then some others. And where are you from? Brisbane and the Gold Coast, 44%. This feels like the elections. Queensland, 12%. And then we've got some people from outside Queensland, but within Australia as well, and about 44%. So again, maybe that is a nice sort of bonus of doing this via webinar. Yeah, thank you. That's perfect. All right, so we'll just close that off and go to the next slide. All right. So the importance of reading success. I think this is going to be a very quick slide because no doubt you'll all know what the importance of reading success is, which is probably why you're here this afternoon. So we all know that literacy is a basic human right. And in this project, we use the term literacy to refer specifically to reading, spelling and writing, because we do know that literacy is sometimes regarded as a broader construct. So the level of reading achievement, of course, especially during those early years, is so important because there's this positive relationship between children's early success in learning to read, their self-perception and self-concept, and then later positive educational outcomes and psychosocial well-being, as well as vocational training opportunities and attainment. So I'm going to leave it at this. And of course, we could probably spend the whole afternoon talking about how important reading success is. It just makes us gives us better access to the world around us. So the rationale then for our Reading Success project, which started about 4 years ago, is that there really is this critical need to lift student outcomes, because we know that a high percentage of Australian students struggle with reading compared to international benchmarks, no matter how we look at it. It's just a fact. So we need to lift student outcomes. And there are different ways of doing this, right? We could, for example, look at the teaching of reading that's happening in our classrooms. And there are a whole lot of people who are looking into that. We could look at pre-service teacher education and see what needs to be changed there. And again, there are a lot of researchers as well as practitioners looking into that. And there are some changes, of course, happening to pre-service teacher education as we speak. Then we could look at professional development events, of course, and they could be for the speech pathologist or the educators, or, professional development for existing professionals, I suppose, in the field. But ultimately, this book isn't about that. And we don't want to get into the reading wars and think about how do we teach reading, right? We strongly believe in the science of reading. And it's been really fantastic to see Pamela Snow and her team develop this solar lab, whatever that stands for, and provide lots of free webinars. But I think we would all agree that what we want is successful readers. So no matter what our philosophy is, no matter how we look at it, if our ultimate goal is the same, that we want kids to become successful readers, then I think that's a fantastic starting point, and we'll take it from there. So then if we look more specifically at the Reading Success project, because I just told you what we weren't about, is really we wanted to promote awareness of the importance of identifying reading profiles to help direct targeted intervention or instruction. And that means that we don't use a one-size-fits-all approach. And I'll come back to that a little bit later, because we often think if we do this for all the children, then they're all going to be successful readers. Well, actually, no, that's not how it works. We want for schools to choose assessments that will inform intervention or that will inform instruction, not by adding more assessments, because we've all seen the data walls in many of these schools, and actually the teachers agreed with us. You know, they're so busy doing assessments. We don't want to add to them. We actually want to determine which ones might be the best ones to use. And then we want to encourage a speech pathology education collaborative. And why is that? Because as speech pathologists, we are becoming increasingly involved in literacy education. And for those of you who are speech pathologists, I was part of the working group who helped develop the clinical guideline on literacy. It ended up being a whole book because we do have real good knowledge about those spoken language skills that are so crucial and that underpin reading development and proficiency. So we need to combine our areas of expertise, because together I think we can do a better job for the kids who struggle in reading development. So then our aims of the Reading Success Project were really to introduce teachers to the simple view of reading, and as a framework to profile students' strengths and weaknesses in important reading skills. And then based on the simple view of reading, we wanted to introduce a stepped approach to facilitate implementation within a school setting. So what we did, you're using my mouse.
Sorry, did you do the poll?
No, not yet. So what we did is, I have my assistant right
Sorry,
here.
I'm stepping in when I shouldn't.
So what we did is we invited a school to participate in the project that we had in mind that was sort of conceptualized about 5 years ago. And now let's do a really quick poll. And all we want to know is, are you familiar with the simple view of reading? So if you don't mind giving us a quick yes, somewhat, or no, that would be very helpful. We've got very fast people. Perfect. Natalie asked, are we recording the session? I think we are. It doesn't tell us anywhere. Well, it looks like it. Perfect. All right. So in response to the question, are you familiar with the simple view of reading? We've got about 50% of people, just over 50%, who says yes. We've got about 16% of people who say somewhat, and we've got about 28% of people who say, no, I'm not familiar with the simple view of reading. And when we run professional development events in schools, it often really depends on the people who attend the seminar, whether they say yes or no. I think as speech pathologists, we're often more familiar with the simple view of reading than some other allied health professionals or educators. So let's look at the simple view of reading then, which is really very simple, because the ultimate aim of learning to read is, of course, to read for comprehension, right? There is no point reading the words on the page if you don't really understand what it's telling you. So the simple view of reading then tells us that reading comprehension is the product, so it's times, not plus, of word recognition and language comprehension. So what that means, that times one, means that neither word recognition nor language comprehension can be zero, because if one of them is zero, there's no reading comprehension. The good example I always use is that I'm actually very good, they tell me, at reading Samoan, because the Samoan vowels are very much like my Dutch vowels. So they tell me that my Samoan is very good, but I have one word in Samoan that I speak, and my reading comprehension is pretty much zero. So that's what that simple view of reading definition tells us. What is interesting about this definition is that there are unique contributions of word recognition and language comprehension to reading comprehension. But there are changing contributions of these two components over time, and I'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. So let's unpack those two really important constructs in a little bit more detail. So the first one is language comprehension, because that's a big, broad concept. So I'm using the definition that Bill Tunmer, one of the original, of course, Simple View of Reading people, and my former colleague from Massey University used. And they say language comprehension is the ability to extract and construct literal and inferred meaning from linguistic discourse represented in speech. So keep that definition in the back of your head, because we will come back to that when we look at reading comprehension and listening comprehension assessments. So you really have to do this at the word level to understand the meanings of the word, at the sentence level, but then also at the discourse or text level. And then Tunmer and Hoover go on to explain that reading comprehension and language comprehension, so think back to that simple view of reading, are defined in a parallel fashion in that model, right? Because they engage the same cognitive processes, except they're different points of access. One is through print and one is through speech. So we can agree to disagree on this view of language and reading comprehension. But if we want to use the simple view of reading as our framework, if you like, then we need to consider them to be equivalent. And that's going to actually influence the assessments we use. So then let's briefly look at word recognition. So that was the other big construct that that is part of the simple view of reading. So again, a definition that I didn't make up is word recognition is the ability to derive accurately and quickly a representation of printed input. So it's what you read that allows access to the appropriate word meaning that is contained in your internal mental lexicon. Right? So basically then that includes your word reading accuracy. So deciphering that this word says cat, but it's also that word reading fluency. So that's once children become more accurate in decoding. You really want them to become automatic, to get automatic fluent word recognition. So if we use that simple view of reading then to identify student needs, or we could say strengths and needs, then you see language comprehension as good at the top and poor at the bottom. And you can see word recognition on the left and the right of your screen, again, from poor to good. So if we use this one as a indicator of strengths and needs, and I just want to put it out there that I'm talking about in the presence of a good teaching environment, right? This is if children have had good access to good reading instruction. Then what we will see is that if you look at the left-hand side, the children with dyslexia would have good language comprehension, but poor word recognition. Our proficient readers would have great word recognition and good language comprehension. Our children, our poor comprehenders, would have good word recognition, but still really struggle with their reading comprehension because they have poor language comprehension. And then in the bottom left-hand quadrant, we have our group of students who might have a mixed reading difficulty, who really struggle in word recognition and language comprehension. So when I said that the contributions of word recognition and listening language comprehension change over time, then this is a really nice slide to help you understand what that means. So as you can see, language comprehension and word recognition in that second grade or second year of schooling, they together explain about 80% of the variance in reading comprehension. Well, actually, that happens across the grades. So there have been lots of follow-up studies into the simple view of reading, and it's actually doing a pretty good job. So about 80% of that variance in reading comprehension is explained by the two components. But during the early years, word recognition will have the greatest influence on your reading comprehension. And why is that? That is because when you're learning to decode, crack the code if you like, then usually the kinds of books that kids are exposed to won't really challenge their language comprehension unless they have significant language impairments. So most of their reading comprehension is really explained by their ability to decode the words on a page. However, once they get to the fourth grade of reading, and hopefully by then children will have learned to accurately and fluently decode the words on a page, that is when our language comprehension starts to have the biggest influence on reading comprehension, although as you can see, quite a bit of that is a shared contribution as well. So sometimes when we talk about that fourth grade reading slump, or kids who all of a sudden seem to hit this real wall, if you like, in progressing in reading, could be the type of students who've had those unidentified language comprehension difficulties that don't become obvious until their fourth or even eighth grade of schooling. So if we then think back to the simple view of reading, what Tummer and Hoover have done just recently, and it's actually very easy to read, well, I think so, journal article that has been published in the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties, is they've sort of reconceptualized it as a cognitive foundations framework. So that really then more clearly outlines those cognitive capacities underlying the learning to read. Because of course you can say, look, word recognition and language comprehension together, give us reading comprehension, but then what? How do you actually learn those? And this does a pretty good job. So what it does is it's a good basis for assessment, and it can be linked to evidence-based instructional strategies for addressing students' individual learning needs. So what I want to point out here, it's not a flow chart and it's not a house. One can actually develop knowledge and skills at several levels at the same time. So that really then underscores the importance of making sure that you address children's strengths and needs across those skills if you need to assess them in the first place. What it does do, it provides a real clear direction for assessment that is linked to evidence-based instructional strategies, as I just said. So underpinning language comprehension then, so this is as deep as we'll go into some of the theory, is really language comprehension, as you could see in that cognitive foundations framework, is made up of linguistic knowledge. So that is sort of your language related knowledge. And we've got our phonological knowledge. I'll run through that in a minute. Semantic knowledge, which is your meanings. Syntactic knowledge, which is your sentence structure kind of knowledge, combined with background knowledge and inferencing skills. So background knowledge is the knowledge you bring to the reading process, or the knowledge you bring to any kind of interactions you have with other people. For example, if you start talking about scuba diving and the other person has never done any scuba diving, then that person wouldn't have the background knowledge to bring to the conversation, if that makes sense. And inferencing skills is really the ability to understand things that weren't mentioned explicitly. So they could be understanding what someone might be planning on doing based on what you might induce from the information that you were given before. So for example, if someone's very excited and they wake up and they find presents downstairs, then straight away you might think, oh, maybe it's a birthday or Christmas, something like that. So on this very, at the bottom of this slide, and I'll quickly run through it, what you can see is that your signal is converted to, or this spoken language comprehension, and really starts with an acoustic signal, as you can see on the bottom left-hand side. Oh, okay. Okay, let's go back to this. The sound waves that are produced by speech that arrive straight into your ear is then converted into a sequence of discrete abstract units, right? And we call them phonemes. And later on, we'll talk about phonemic awareness. It's that appreciation of sounds in words or language through the process of speech perception, right? And then those phonemes present the basic units in a language that mark differences in meanings. Consider, for example, the difference between bad and pad. Now, hopefully you can hear that. I should have come up with a different one. Bad and mad, how's that, right? The only difference is the initial phoneme, but you still end up with two very distinctly different words from a meaning perspective. So that's where your lexical access comes from, and your mental lexicon is the vocabulary you have or understand. So although the meaning of an utterance really then depends on the meanings of the words, of course, you need to put that into the context of a sentence or into the context of an overall body or text at that discourse level, right? And then what we need to do is we need to bring that background knowledge, the knowledge about the world, to fully understand what's going on. So this is my very quick explanation. And if you wanted some further information on that, the article does a good job. Then briefly underpinning word recognition, of course, to really recognize a word on the page, you need to be able to map letters or letter combinations on phonological forms. I can tell you it's much easier to learn to read Dutch because it's very, very transparent. So beginning readers must really then acquire that alphabetic coding skills. So they go from analytic, figuring out that at is cat, to automatic word recognition, where you really look at a word and you read it. It's actually pretty amazing if you think about it. And there's Shay's self-teaching hypothesis is that the more you read, the more you're exposed to reading, the better you'll get at it and the more automatic it'll become. So basically then the knowledge of that alphabetic principle relies on letter knowledge and phonemic awareness. And phonemic awareness is that awareness of that spoken words are made up of sounds or phonemes. Wrong one. Okay. So then to finish off this part of our presentation, we really cannot underestimate the importance of other factors that will influence children's reading development, right? For example, their prior knowledge and skills that are associated with a diverse range of literacies. Their personal motivation and self-perception, do they see themselves as a reader? Are they motivated to read? Their level of self-confidence, like I'm a good learner, for example. We need to look at home and community environments. We also want to consider, of course, the teaching environment, like what resources are available at the school. What do the teachers know and what is the quality of the teaching? So some of this we actually touch on in the book, especially looking at children's self-perception. We've also, Georgina has conducted interviews with the teachers and really looked at the resources available, but we're not focusing on that today. All right, I'm going to hand over to Beck.
Thank you, Marleen. So I'm now going to move back to discussing our Reading Success project and unpack how we applied those theoretical underpinnings that Marleen just spoke about in a particular school context. So what we did as part of our project is we applied a 5-step assessment to intervention process. And this process was really guided by the simple view of reading. And the aim of these 5 steps was really to be able to identify students who had reading difficulties through a comprehensive assessment process, and then to use that information to be able to provide targeted intervention for those students. So very briefly, I'm going to talk through these 5 steps while we can see them on the one slide, and then I'm going to unpack that in relation to the specific assessments that we conducted as part of our Reading Success project. So as part of step 1, we began by assessing students' reading skills using a standardised reading assessment, and that reading assessment captured students' reading comprehension skills and also their reading accuracy and reading rate, or reading fluency as Marleen referred to at the start of the presentation. We then looked more closely at those students who had identified difficulties in their reading comprehension skills as part of step 1, to look more closely at their reading accuracy and their language comprehension skills. Step 3 involved focusing on those students who had been identified with below expectations in terms of their reading accuracy. So we looked more closely at their word recognition skills. We then used this information that we collected from steps 1, 2, and 3 to create speech-to-print profiles of strengths and weaknesses for each of the students who demonstrated difficulties in their reading comprehension performance. And then as part of step 5, we provided targeted intervention for those students based on their individual reading profiles. So to have a look at each of those steps in a little bit more detail and start to have a look at what assessments were used to collect that information as part of our project. So step 1, as I mentioned, focused on assessing students' reading skills. And as part of this project, we used the York Assessment of Reading for Comprehension, also known as the YARC. The YARC allowed us to gain an understanding of the students' reading comprehension skills, so their ability to answer questions related to a passage that they had read. We also gathered information about their reading accuracy, so their ability to accurately read the passages aloud, and also reading rate, so their ability to read fluently. As part of this project, we applied a cutoff of a standard score of 85 to indicate children who had difficulties in their reading comprehension as well as their reading accuracy and reading rate. So as we go through these different steps, we're going to mention different assessments that we used as part of our project, but we did just want to flag that there is a wide range of assessment tools that are available within school settings and for different professionals. So we are going to provide a little bit of justification or explanation around the specific tools that we used, but we're definitely not saying that these are the only tools available. And that it does need to be a collaborative process as part of the school team to work out which assessments would be best to capture the information that's needed. So for this particular study, we chose the YARC because we really needed an assessment tool that was going to allow us to assess reading comprehension. That was one of the big ticket items that we wanted for this assessment. As we were conducting this assessment in an Australian school context, we also really wanted an assessment that had Australian normative data. And this was important so that we could ensure that the comparisons that we were making within this school context were relevant for the Australian school system. And so based on other available evidence in relation to existing tools, the YARC was chosen to be the most relevant for us to capture that information. As part of step 2, then, we looked further at the reading profiles of the students based on those their performance on the reading comprehension component of the YARC. And this is really where, as Marleen mentioned about the simple view of reading, was really guided the assessments that we chose as part of this step. So we looked at those students who had difficulties in reading comprehension, and we checked their language comprehension skills and also their reading accuracy skills so that we could see whether their abilities in these areas were contributing to their reading comprehension profiles. So to screen for the students' language comprehension skills, we used the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, and we used both the 4th and 5th edition with our different cohorts, and it was the understanding spoken paragraphs subtest of this particular assessment. So for the speech pathologists listening, you'll be very familiar with this assessment, but to those who might not be, this Subtest involves students listening to a spoken paragraph and then answering questions about what they had heard. So it very much parallels what they needed to do in that reading comprehension component, but this time it was done in the oral language domain. So really capturing their spoken discourse language comprehension skills. So for our study, again, we chose the self because it assessed language comprehension at that discourse level, which was what we were really looking for. It also has normative data, so it did allow us to classify the students' performance, but we did just want to flag that with this particular assessment, it is a restricted test, which means that speech pathologists are the only ones who can administer it, and it can be quite costly, particularly if you're only using this assessment for the one subtest component. So it is important to think about that within the school system to determine whether that assessment is the most appropriate or not. In our book, we do suggest considering using the YARC parallel test form as another consideration for checking students' language comprehension skills. So it's important to have that guided conversation as part of the school team to determine which assessment is most appropriate to check students' language comprehension skills. And then also as part of this step, we checked students' reading accuracy skills. So this meant looking at their YARC reading accuracy results to determine whether they showed average or below average performance. Again, using that standard score cutoff of 85. As part of step 3, we then looked more closely at those students who had difficulties or performed below expectations on the reading accuracy measure of the YARC, and we did further assessments to check their word recognition skills. And when you refer back to the cognitive foundations framework that Marleen spoke about, this was really allowing us to look more closely at those skills that we know can contribute to students' reading accuracy performance. And so we looked closely at their single word reading skills, also their orthographic knowledge, so really looking at that knowledge of their alphabetic principle and being able to correspond letters with the appropriate sounds, and also looking at their phonological and phonemic awareness. So as part of this project, we administered the Castles and Coulthart test as an indication of single word reading skills. This assessment again was chosen because it has some Australian normative information. It's also freely available, and it gave us an indication of the students' single word reading skills across regular, irregular, and also nonsense words. In terms of orthographic knowledge, we administered the letter sound test, which is also an assessment that's freely available, and it allowed us to profile the students' ability to sound out single letters and letter combinations. And then in terms of phonological awareness, so for our younger cohort of students, we administered the Sutherland Phonological Awareness Test, and the older students, we completed the comprehensive test of phonological processing. So again, as I mentioned earlier, these are not the only assessments that are available, but they were chosen as part of this project to really be able to capture and profile the students' skills based on the context in which we were conducting the study. And I am conscious there's a few questions coming through in the chat, and we're going to address those ones at the end during question time. So definitely keep writing them in, and we're definitely seeing them, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Then as part of step 4, we then used the information that we gathered from steps 1 to 3 to create speech to print profiles for each of the students who had identified difficulties with reading comprehension. And so when we look at the speech to print profiles, I'm going to challenge your reading a little bit here, because we're actually going to work from right to left, which goes against what we normally would do when processing written information. But what we can see on the right-hand side of our speech to print profile is a focus on written language. And the speech to print profile, which we've adapted with permission from Gail Gillen, allows us to classify and understand students' skills in terms of their understanding of rules and concepts of written language, and also at the word and text level as well. So as part of our project, we started at the text level because we administered the YARC as part of step 1, which allowed us to profile the students' skills in terms of their reading comprehension, reading accuracy, and reading fluency. We also looked closely at their word level skills, so that word recognition across those different word types, and also their grapheme to phoneme correspondences, so that orthographic knowledge as well. And then on the left-hand side of our speech to print profile captures spoken language. And as part of spoken language, we're talking about specific elements of knowledge of the spoken language, as well as skills encompassing phonological processing, so awareness, as well as storage and retrieval. So we were interested in understanding the students' knowledge in relation to their vocabulary, their syntax, morphology, text structure, and phonology. And this maps back quite nicely to what Marleen spoke about in relation to language comprehension and the different components that are needed for children to have understanding and knowledge of the language. We also considered phonological awareness skills, so at that syllable level, and then also starting to look more closely at their phoneme knowledge as well. And we also know that storage and retrieval is really important for children and is also closely related to their relationship with developing written language skills, so their ability to retrieve spoken information. And so in a few slides' time, Marleen's going to give some case study examples to look at how we mapped our assessment data to these speech to print profiles. But one thing we wanted to flag was that we really do encourage completing something like a speech to print profile as a collaborative process as part of the school team. So having teachers, speech pathologists, learning support staff, anyone who's involved in the remedial teaching of reading at the school to contribute to completing this speech to print profile so that it's a holistic representation of the information that's available about that child. And then you can use something like this to guide conversations about where further information might be needed, whether further assessments are needed, and who's going to complete those assessments. And this information can then be used to drive intervention planning as well. And then step 5 leads us into our intervention initiatives. And so as part of this step in our project, we conducted small-scale projects which targeted children's reading profiles. So we really used that information that was collected from our assessments to make sure that the intervention that was provided was specific to the students' reading skills. So as Marleen said at the start, it definitely wasn't a one-size-fits-all. Our intervention initiatives were very much targeted for those assessment results that was really guiding the intervention that they received. And so in a couple of slides' time, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of these different interventions that we provided and a bit of a rationale as to why we identified those students. So let's now have a look at the exciting part of what did we find. After putting all of that into place, what were our results from our project? So as part of our webinar today, we are only focusing on the results of our Year 4 cohort because to anyone who's read the book, we have a lot of information that has been collected. So if you are interested in finding out more about our earlier cohort, you can definitely access that information in our book. So our Year 4 cohort is where we started as part of this project, and this was because it was identified by the school where the study was completed as being an area of particular concern for the teachers with this the students' reading skills. So as part of step 1, we assessed the students' reading comprehension skills using the YARC. And what we found was that the YARC did help us to differentiate students who had reading difficulties. And it helped us to identify that over 40% of students in this Year 4 cohort were showing below average skills in reading comprehension. As part of step 2, we then assessed or looked at their text level reading accuracy. So we revisited the YARC to have a look at their performance in terms of their reading accuracy. And we found that over half of the students who had difficulties in reading comprehension did also demonstrate or were demonstrating difficulties in their reading accuracy skills. In terms of their language comprehension, so this was where we administered the self-understanding spoken paragraphs, we found that just under half, so 40% of children were demonstrating difficulties in their language comprehension skills. So we're starting to get an understanding, an idea of how their abilities in reading accuracy and language comprehension were contributing to their below average reading comprehension skills. As part of step 3, this involved looking more closely at the students' skills in those areas of word recognition, and we found that 17 of the 18 students did demonstrate below average word recognition skills when we looked at their single word reading. So this flowchart is a little bit busy, but I will talk you through it, and we do provide some more information in the book to provide context and understanding of this. But what the flowchart allows us to do is to look descriptively at that decision process and the results that we attained from steps 1 and 2. So firstly, looking at whether the student's reading comprehension was below expectations. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we identified that 33 students did have difficulties in their reading comprehension. So for those students, we checked whether their reading accuracy was below expectations on the YARC. This then allowed us to identify that 18 students did have difficulties with their reading accuracy, whereas 15 students demonstrated average reading accuracy performance on the YARC. We then looked at their language comprehension skills. And so for these 18 students who had difficulties with their reading accuracy, we found that 7 also demonstrated language comprehension difficulties. So this allowed us to identify that 7 students in this cohort presented with mixed reading difficulties. So they had difficulties in both reading accuracy and language comprehension, which was contributing to their reading comprehension difficulties. On the other hand, though, we had 10 students who were identified with specific word reading difficulties. So they demonstrated below average reading accuracy skills, but average language comprehension skills. So their difficulties were stemming from difficulties at the word recognition level. And then for these 15 students, we identified that 6 of those students demonstrated below expectations with their language comprehension. So were classified as having a specific comprehension profile. And then we had 9 students who were in this non-specified reading profile. And so for those students, we do talk about them in the book in more detail to start to understand what might have been contributing to their difficulties, because based on the assessments that were administered, they didn't demonstrate difficulties in reading accuracy or language comprehension, but had shown difficulties with reading comprehension. So we suggest possible difficulties with comprehension monitoring, as well as maybe working memory. So further assessment was needed for those children. So I'm now going to hand back over to Marleen to talk about the case studies.
All right. So we just wanted to give you a couple of case studies of Year 4 students. So we're going to call them Will and Hannah. And the teacher actually had both of these students in her classroom and had identified reading difficulties in both students, but wasn't quite sure what the next step would be for these two students. So the first one is Hannah, and Hannah's 9 years, 8 months, and in, like I said, Year 4, and didn't have English as an additional dialect or language, or was from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. So on the YARC, she scored standard scores of 73, below 70 and below 70. So if we think about 85 to 115 as being within the sort of normal range, then she scored significantly below expectations on all 3. And if you wanted to put an age equivalence on it, which we usually don't do, but it came out as about 6 years of age. So she had significant difficulties. No formal verification of language impairment. And interestingly, on the NAPLAN in Year 3, she was in a reading band 3, which actually wasn't then flagged as a huge concern on reading at that stage. So if we then look at her speech-to-print profile. I'm just going to give you a very simplified version. So this is the same as the one that Beck showed you earlier, just a little less cluttered. We have spoken language and written language, and significant difficulties in reading comprehension. And then once we completed her spoken language or her speech-to-print profile, what you can see is real challenges in spoken language skills on the left-hand side. She actually scored within normal limits on phonemic awareness, significant difficulties with storage and retrieval of phonological information. And then on the written language side, word recognition difficulties, orthographic knowledge, she came out very low, as well as reading accuracy and reading rate. So she is one of the case examples in the book and has a mixed reading difficulties profile. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you what that looks like on, our paper form with all these scores inserted, and that is really up to the team how they want to deal with the noting down the performances. But this is what we gave the teachers. So at the end of our testing of the first cohort, we had a full-day professional development seminar, and we handed out the speech-to-print profiles to teachers. And to be honest, the green and red is probably not something that is very nice to look at, but it does actually show you how two students who can have very similar reading difficulties in a teacher's opinion come out as very different when we look at their speech-to-print profile. So I'm going to move on to Will, who was also 9 years, 7 months, similar sort of cultural background, reading accuracy, again, 71, below 70 and 79, and again, an age equivalence of about 6 years of age. Again, no formal verification of language impairment, and on the NAPLAN, again, he was in reading band 3. So at face value, Will actually looks very similar based on the YARC results to Hannah. But if we look at his speech-to-print profile, what you can actually see is, again, on the right-hand side, he really struggles in his word recognition, orthographic knowledge, and then reading accuracy, comprehension, and rate. But he has real strengths in spoken language skills on the left-hand side of this profile, adequate phonological awareness skills, although he did show difficulties in phonological processing. And we are not going to go into more detail in that today, but we do know that children who have specific word reading difficulties, sometimes also referred to as dyslexia, will have difficulties in phonological processing. So looking at his speech-to-print profile on, the one that we shared with the teachers, you can see a very different color profile. And I need to point out that the blue bits are the ones that we still wanted to investigate further at that stage. All right, back to you.
Thank you. So as part of step 5, this was where we were now providing some intervention for the children based on their reading profiles. So as I mentioned earlier, this was using that information from their speech-to-print profile to really then guide the intervention that students were receiving. So as part of the Reading Success Project, we did put in place a couple of different interventions, and these were in collaboration with the school team, and it was really about talking with the school team and the teachers about understanding the children's reading profile and then providing intervention that was specific based on that information that had been collected from our comprehensive assessment process. So looking at one of our initiatives, and we go into a lot more detail about these interventions in the book, but just to give a bit of an overview, one of them was focused on those students who had difficulties in reading comprehension or language comprehension skills. So these were 8 children that we'd identified with difficulties on the YARC in terms of their reading comprehension as well as the SELF. and they participated in a 6-week intervention which focused on expository discourse. So importantly, to be provided with this intervention, it was very much focused on those children who had demonstrated difficulties in terms of their comprehension skills. So as part of this 6-week intervention, children participated in 2 60-minute group sessions per week, and there was 4 children in the group. It was delivered by a speech pathologist, and it involved content and topics from the classroom. So it really did involve the speech pathologist talking with the teacher about content areas, books that were going to be a focus in upcoming lessons, and they were then the focus of this 6-week intervention block. Each of the sessions covered 4 key components. So looking at vocabulary, so really focusing on identifying Tier 2 words and explicitly teaching those words as part of the lesson, reciprocal teaching, as well as figurative language, and also then focusing on the students practicing their spoken expository discourse as well. And this intervention was based on work by Clark and colleagues to make sure that students were receiving rich interaction and high quality contextualised discussion. Do you want me to address it? Yeah. So there's just been one question in relation to expository discourse. So as part of, do you want to speak to that in terms of the intervention?
No, I think just explain what it is. So, okay. We just saw a question pop up about the expository discourse. So basically, how we assess expository discourse is often procedural. So we ask children to explain the rules of a game, for example, or a favorite sport. But of course, there are many different types of expository discourse. So our intervention also targeted descriptive expository discourse. What was it?
Providing a summary.
Yeah. Summarizing information, but also compare and contrast. So again, we have explained that in a bit more detail. So why expository discourse and not narrative is because actually once children reach that 4th year of schooling, much of the textbooks that kids engage with are actually more around expository discourse than they are about narrative. So that's the choice. Hopefully that makes sense.
And then our other intervention, one of the other intervention initiatives that we put in place was focusing on phonological processing. So this was aimed at those students who had been identified with specific word reading difficulties. So really aimed at those students who had difficulties with word recognition. So there were 12 children based on the data collected as part of this project, and they participated in a 6-week intervention that did focus on those phonological processing skills. So thinking back to that speech to print profile and that cognitive framework as well. And so as part of this 6-week intervention, the children participated in a 60-minute group session and also a 30-minute individual session per week. Again, both of those sessions were delivered by a speech pathologist, and it was firmly based on previous research from Gillen and Dodd, and also to those that are familiar with the Lindemood phoneme sequencing program, it also had that aspect to it. So not going to go into detail about that particular program, but it was a scripted program, but the speech pathologist was able to manipulate the materials that were focused on in that session based on the students' skills and difficulties. So it was very much individualized based on their profiles on the assessment, and also then how they were going across each week, because the speech pathologist used tracking sheets to monitor the students' progress and then adjusted the session accordingly. At the same time as participating in that phonological processing intervention, students also completed a 6-week intervention with the Reading Doctor app, Letter Sounds 2 Pro. So students were given access to this app for 2 times a week for approximately 10 to 15 minutes under the supervision of the speech pathologist to make sure that they were focusing on the app. And to those that aren't familiar with the Reading Doctor app. Very briefly, it's about children being taught to meaningfully associate the way that letters look with the speech sounds that they typically represent. And it uses a combination of visual, auditory and articulatory memory aids with the student around that. Initially, the app was programmed individually based on the student's LEST results, and then the app is able to automatically adjust each time the student engages with it to focus on the letters and sound combinations that the child might not know or might be confusing those patterns as part of their interactions with the app. So they were some examples of the different intervention initiatives. And as I mentioned, we do go into a bit more detail in the book and also provide some information about what we found as well.
We could have spent all day.
We could have. 1 hour was just not enough to cover all elements of the project.
Yeah. All right. So I think we just want to wrap up by highlighting some of the things we've learned and some of the things we'd like you to take away, if you like. So first of all, assessment is important, right? But some of the considerations are really be cautious of over-assessment, because at some stage enough is enough. So what we also did as part of the project is we compared the YARC, how did the YARC perform, compared to the PET-R, which was typically used in year 4. Do you want to share that just briefly? Yeah.
So in relation to, so the PET-R was administered with the year 4 cohort by the school. And we did find that in terms of the correlation between the students' performance on the YARC and the PET-R, it wasn't, the PET-R wasn't as sensitive at picking up students, particularly in terms of those children with reading comprehension difficulties. So we found that it was better at identifying those students with word recognition difficulties, but it didn't capture as many children with reading comprehension difficulties as the YARC. Whereas in terms of the PM benchmark, which was what the school was using with the earlier cohort, we did find that it was more a higher correlation between the YARC and the PM benchmark. So we did find that compared to the PET-R, the PM benchmark was capturing the same, a similar level of students with difficulties. But I suppose our caution around the PM benchmark, and to those that are familiar with this as an assessment tool, is that it provides you with a level that's interpreted, but it's not giving you any information about the students' reading profiles. And so one of the key take-home messages around our project is really the fact that we want to be able to understand the students' unique strengths and difficulties when we're administering a reading assessment. So for that reason, the PM benchmark isn't really sensitive enough to tell you about the students' specific reading profiles.
Yeah, and some of the feedback we've received from readers is that the PM benchmark is sometimes actually not administered the way it should be. So we've got to be very careful in what we, I suppose, recommend and what we want to get out of the assessment. And the PET-R stands for Progressive Achievement Test Revised. Yeah. The second consideration is really who does the assessment, and should it be the YARC, right? We like the YARC for all sorts of reasons, as Beck explained earlier, but it is time consuming. We actually, in the second year of the project, we helped the teachers, or the teachers wanted to do the assessments themselves, and the speech pathologist at the time did some coaching of that, and we did some administration that way. Again, this is something that the schools will need to discuss with the rest of the literacy team. And the other one is, do we need to assess all children? You know, we're not saying you do or you don't, but we need to make really good informed decisions. And maybe we can leave out some tests that weren't very informative and do the YARC instead. And what assessments to use. I'm sure you all think like, oh, do we need to use this assessment or that assessment? We have actually provided a whole long list, again, in the book of potential assessments that are useful to use. But as long as they fit that speech-to-print profile, there are many other ways you can obtain assessment results. Would you agree? Yeah. And then when should the assessments take place? Year 4, boy, oh boy, that's a bit late to identify children who really had dyslexia type reading profiles, and we all agreed that that was the case. So early intervention, early assessment is really the key. So I think implementation of a process such as this should happen early on rather than later. And that's an interesting one. So high quality assessment results should really drive instructional practices. And when we were at the school in the second year, I think some of the teachers had gone to a professional development event and had discovered the Haggerty program. And by the way, we have no financial interest in anything that we actually present today. The book is free to download. We don't own the Haggerty program. We like the Reading Doctor software guy, Bartek, but again, he gives us no money. And then the school implemented the Haggerty program. Actually, we had discovered the kids were doing really well. In that first year of schooling, they'd all gone through that Read It Again Foundation Q. There were very few children who were struggling in phonological awareness. So was that needed then? I'd like to think not. The same with the Reading Doctor software. It's an amazing program. Do all kids need access to it? I don't think so. So again, I think we've got to be very careful that we don't waste time on things that aren't needed, because it's time that we could use for other instructional practices.
And so in terms of, as we've kind of captured as part of this presentation today, it was really about making sure that high quality assessments such as what we applied throughout our process allowed us to identify individual profiles and really identify children's strengths and weaknesses across those different areas. This then led us to being able to use that information to map it to speech-to-print profiles, to then use that information to provide targeted intervention at the level that was appropriate for each of the students. As part of this process and working closely with teachers, it really also, and the feedback that we got from teachers as well, improved their understanding of what skills needed to be addressed in reading intervention and really who should be involved. It was very much a collaborative team approach. And also that providing this targeted intervention did result in an improvement in the skills that were addressed in the intervention, which really highlighted the fact that if we have high quality assessment, it can really drive intervention practices and make a difference for students.
All right, so we've come to the end of this. And really our take-home messages have been shared vision and communication are so important. We worked really closely with Professor Georgina Barton, and Georgina and I have become very good friends, even though we haven't always agreed on some of the terminology, for example, or the ways to address literacy, or the way we do assessments or interpret assessments. But we've learned a lot from each other because we did have that shared vision of, successful readers. Evidence-based practice is so important. I hope you all agree with us. Assessment is important. We need early identification, and then let's collaborate on this. Let's not disagree. Let's just agree to disagree at times. But if we all collaborate and are part of the literacy team, I think we will actually achieve more than we sometimes currently do. Professional development isn't a once-off. There is lots of evidence out there that professional development, just a once-off seminar, for example, won't change practice. Actually, coaching is needed and ongoing involvement is needed. And yeah, as you put as your last point, research to practice really does take time and effort. And that's okay. So if you do read the book, what you'll learn, teachers tell us they really liked getting a more detailed knowledge around assessment practices for that individualized reading support. They actually really liked our speech to print profiles and the color coding. The one that Georgina added was the importance of acknowledging student voice, you know, and hopefully you'll enjoy the case studies, including some of the interviews that Georgina did with some of the kids and their opinions on reading instruction in the classroom. The school leaders really like that evidence-based rationale for collecting and analyzing student reading data. They're in a difficult position, you know, because sometimes their central organization tells them what assessments need to be done, because then it can be compared to other schools. So we've got to be aware of that, but they loved having that real good, strong rationale. And I'd like to think for speech pathologists, we are an integral member of the literacy team. I think our knowledge in spoken language is so important. And, you know, even with really good literacy practices in education, there will always be 7 to 14% of children who will struggle with reading because they have reading disorders. And I think that's where we can really make a difference. And it will give us more detailed knowledge around support for students who struggle in reading, and it'll give us a nice template to talk to teachers and to try and speak the same language. We still speak in different terms at times. Oh, our final one.
One final poll.
All right.
So we just wanted to capture whether you have read The Reading Success in the Primary Years. So I've read our book, either a yes, a no, but you're now planning to read it, or no, you're not planning to read it.
Which is fine too, and it's all anonymous, so don't worry. But
we'll be honest.
Perfect. Well, while you're completing that, oh, we need to go back to this. For questions and feedback, we're always happy to get feedback. You can email us. I also have a website, personal website, no financial interest. And the idea is that we will put, if the recording happens, we will put the recording and the slides up on my website. And we will also try and email you with this information. And we are happy to take some questions.
Yep.
All right.
A great question that's there is, where do you find the book? Do you have a link to it on your website, Marleen?
I think if you type in Reading Success in the Primary Years, it will actually come up, and you will get the, that's what it looks like. And just go to Springer link and you can download a copy for free. It's open access.